Omaha Beach, Normandy, the morning of June 6, 1944. Inside a concrete casemate above a shallow ravine, the Allies had marked on their maps as the Colville Draw. A German gunner of the 352nd Infantry Division stands beside a 75mm field gun. Notice first where the gun is pointing. It does not point out to sea, it points sideways, down the length of the sand, angled so that its shells will sweep the beach from one end to the other, rather than fire at the ships gathering on the horizon. The wall facing the water is a slab of reinforced concrete with no opening in it at all. The firing slit is cut into the flank of the position, screened by a short wing of concrete, hidden from anyone looking in from the channel. None of this is accidental. It is the entire idea. The men who built this position had reasoned, carefully, that a warship firing from open water would need to place a shell directly through a narrow slit to kill the gun behind it. So they had turned the slit away from the sea, where no such shot was possible. The gunner has been told, in effect, that the sea cannot reach him where he stands. For the first 2 hours of the invasion, that promise holds completely. The American infantry who land in front of him are cut down in the shallows and thrown into confusion on the shingle. His gun, and the guns on either side of him, are doing exactly what they were designed to do. And then, sometime after 8 in the morning, he looks out through the drifting smoke and sees something the doctrine he had trusted did not account for. An American destroyer, a warship of some 1,600 tons, is standing straight in toward the beach. It does not stop at the range the plans had assumed. It keeps coming. It comes until the water beneath it is barely deep enough to hold it up, until riflemen on the shore can reach it with small arms fire, until the men on its deck can pick out individual firing slits with the naked eye. And then it turns its whole side toward the land and begins firing its 5-inch guns straight into the strong points, at a range where a miss is almost harder than a hit. Prisoners taken in this sector in the days that followed said versions of the same thing to the officers who questioned them. They could not understand how the warships had been allowed to come so close. In the German picture of a coastal battle, the sea was a place of distance. Naval guns were a threat you answered with thick concrete and clever angles, and the whole arithmetic of that answer depended on the ships staying far out, where their fire was scattered and unreliable. The destroyers had simply refused to stay far out. They had thrown away the distance the entire defensive scheme was built to exploit. And once the distance was gone, the concrete and the clever angles stopped meaning very much, because a 5-inch shell fired from 1,000 yards did not need to find a hidden slit. It only needed to keep striking the position until something inside it broke. So how did a defensive system this well-engineered, a system that was strangling the largest amphibious landing in history for the better part of a morning, come apart against ships that were never supposed to be able to hurt it? The answer is not that the German gunners were poorly trained. A good many of them were skilled, and some were veterans of other fronts. The answer is not that the concrete was badly poured, because those same casemates still stand on that coast today, cracked but unbowed. The answer lies in the gap between two different ideas of what a warship was for, and it lies with a handful of American destroyer captains who, on their own authority, in direct violation of the orders they had been given, decided that the rules written for their ships did not fit the disaster unfolding in front of them. To understand why the Germans could not believe what they were seeing, you first have to take their defenses seriously, because they were genuinely excellent. And then you have to understand exactly what the ships did, because it was something ships were simply not built to do. Begin, then, with what the German army had constructed along this 4-mile crescent of Norman coast. The beach the Allies had code-named Omaha was the strongest natural defensive position of all 5 invasion beaches, and it was not close. Behind the tidal flat and the bank of shingle rose a steep, grassy bluff, in places 150 feet high, and that bluff was cut in only 5 places by ravines the planners called draws. Those draws were the only routes by which vehicles could climb up off the sand and move inland, and the Germans understood their value as clearly as the Allies did. So they turned the draws, and the high ground between them, into a chain of fortified strongpoints. In German, these positions were called Widerstandsnester, which translates as resistance nests, and they were numbered in sequence along the coast, running roughly from 60 in the east up into the 70s in the west. There were somewhere around 15 of them overlooking Omaha, linked to one another by trenches and by tunnels dug back into the face of the bluff, and together they held a dense and carefully arranged inventory of weapons. That inventory is worth laying out plainly because it explains the slaughter of the first waves. The strongpoints mounted field guns of 75mm and larger inside concrete casemates. There were numerous smaller anti-tank guns, many of them 50mm weapons, sighted low and angled to fire along the beach rather than out at the sea. There were dozens of machine gun positions, a great many of them built around the MG-42, a weapon that could throw well over 1,000 rounds a minute and made a tearing sound that the American survivors never forgot as long as they lived. There were mortars ranged in advance onto fixed points on the sand, dug into pits shaped in the pattern the Germans called Tobruks. There were rocket launcher sites, and there were obsolete tank turrets set into concrete emplacements. One careful accounting of the sector lists 8 large gun casemates, more than 30 smaller pillboxes, several artillery batteries, well over a dozen anti-tank guns, a series of mortar pits, dozens of rocket positions, and something on the order of 85 machine gun nests. Every part of it had been laid out so that the fields of fire overlapped, so that a man crossing the open sand was never outside the cone of at least one weapon, and usually several at once. But the true genius of the position was not the sheer number of guns. It was the geometry. The heavy guns in their casemates had not been placed to trade blows with the invasion fleet. They had been placed to fire in enfilade. That word deserves a plain explanation, because it is the hinge on which this whole story turns. To fire in enfilade means to fire along the length of a target, rather than straight at its face. Picture a line of men wading ashore through the surf. A gun firing directly out to sea sees only the narrow front of that line and can strike perhaps 1 or 2 men before it has to shift. But a gun firing from the flank, straight along the beach, looks down the entire length of that line, and a single traverse of its barrel can cut through dozens of men standing one behind another. The German casemates at Omaha had been built precisely to do that. Their embrasures were turned to face along the sand, not out at the water, and the heavy sides of the casemates were angled so that those firing slits pointed away from the channel. The seaward face of each position was a smooth, sloping mass of concrete, shaped to shrug off anything the fleet might throw at it. There was a hard and rather elegant piece of engineering reasoning underneath this arrangement. The weakest point of any gun casemate is its embrasure, the very opening the gun must fire through. If that opening faces the enemy directly, then the enemy's fire can be aimed straight into it, and a single well-placed shell, threaded through the slit, can kill everyone inside and wreck the gun. The German engineers had reasoned that it was far safer to turn the opening away from the sea altogether, to fire diagonally across the beach from the flank, and to hide the slit behind a protecting wing of concrete. A warship out in the channel, looking at such a casemate, would see almost no opening at all. It would see only an angled bank of concrete presenting its thickest, strongest surface. This is the exact reverse of the image most people carry in their heads, of a bunker glaring out to sea and blazing away at the ships. The real casemates at Omaha, for the most part, did not look at the ships at all. They looked along the sand, where the men were, and they kept their one vulnerable point, the throat of the gun, turned carefully away from the guns of the fleet. The largest of these positions sat on the high ground above the Colleville Draw, on the eastern half of the beach, and the Germans had numbered it 62. It was less a single bunker than a small fortress. It held 2 casemates for field guns, several machine gun pits, mortar positions, and an observation post from which an artillery officer could direct the fire of guns sighted further inland, all of it ringed by a water-filled anti-tank ditch and belts of barbed wire. From that height, the men in Strongpoint 62 could see the entire eastern beach spread out below them like a map, and for hours on the morning of the invasion, they turned that view into a killing ground. The infantry coming ashore beneath them had almost nowhere to hide. The men holding these positions, moreover, were better than Allied intelligence had led anyone to expect. The invasion planners had believed that Omaha was defended mainly by a single second-rate static division, the kind of formation stiffened with older men and with conscripts pressed in from occupied countries, the kind of unit left to watch a quiet stretch of coastline. In reality, a full and capable field division, the 352nd Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Dietrich Kreis, had moved forward toward this coast during the spring, some weeks before the landings. This was a genuine and costly intelligence failure, though it has often been exaggerated in the retelling, because not every man of that division was standing on the beach that morning. The strongpoints themselves were manned chiefly by one of the division's grenadier regiments, together with elements of the older static division and the artillery observers who directed the guns from behind. The defenders were more numerous, more alert, and more capable than the men climbing down into the landing craft had been told to expect, and they fought with skill and determination. Behind the whole design stood a defensive philosophy that belonged to one man more than to any other, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel had been given the task of strengthening these coastal defenses, and he had thrown himself into the work with the restless energy that marked everything he did, driving forward the building of obstacles, the pouring of casemates, and the laying of millions of mines along the coast. His conviction was simple, and it had been forged in hard experience. He believed the invasion had to be stopped at the water's edge, in the first hours, before the Allies could land the overwhelming weight of men and material that would follow. He told his own staff that the first day would decide everything. To his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, he put it in words that have echoed ever since. The war, he said, would be won or lost on the beaches. The one chance to stop the enemy would come while he was still in the water, struggling to get ashore. The first 24 hours of the invasion, Rommel told him, would be decisive, and for both the Allies and Germany, it would be the longest day. And a central pillar of Rommel's thinking, the thing that shaped where the guns were placed and how carefully they were protected from the sea, was a deep and well-founded respect, close to dread, of Allied naval gunfire. That dread was not theoretical. The German army had already stood beneath heavy naval bombardment in the Mediterranean, at Sicily, and at Salerno, and at Anzio, and the memory was raw. German commanders had watched their own counterattacks broken apart by fire from battleships and cruisers lying offshore, fire that fell on their tanks and infantry from a distance beyond the reach of any weapon they possessed to answer it. One German general recorded that his troops had to endure the most severe fire from a wall of battleships, cruisers, and large destroyers. Another wrote that his tanks had suffered heavily under naval gunfire, against which they had nothing to reply. The war diaries of the Italian fighting recorded, in effect, that the fire of Allied warships had halted German attacks before they could drive the landings back into the sea. So the men who designed the defenses of Omaha were not ignorant of what naval guns could do to them. They designed the entire position precisely to survive that fire. Thick seaward walls, embrasures angled away from the channel, guns hidden from the fleet, every element turned to defeat the threat coming off the water. Measured against the kind of naval bombardment the Germans had actually experienced, delivered by big ships standing well out to sea, it was an intelligent and rational design. And in the opening bombardment on the morning of the invasion, that design was largely vindicated. The Allied fire plan for Omaha was, in hindsight, badly inadequate, and some of the men responsible for it knew as much even before the landing. The naval bombardment before the troops went in was deliberately kept short, a little over half an hour, because the planners wanted to preserve the element of surprise, and because they were relying heavily on air power to do the real work of destruction. That reliance proved to be a grave mistake. Hundreds of heavy bombers had been assigned to pulverize the beach defenses, but they were forced to bomb blind through a thick layer of cloud, and to be certain they did not drop their loads onto the landing craft crowding the water below, the crews held their release for a few extra seconds. A few seconds, at that height and that speed, translated into miles on the ground. The enormous weight of bombs meant to shatter the strongpoints fell instead on the fields and hedgerows well inland, killing farm animals and cratering pastures and leaving the concrete on the bluff, very nearly untouched. The commander of the American Amphibious Force for Omaha, Rear Admiral John Hall, felt the inadequacy of the fire plan so strongly that he later described sending men against the largest amphibious attack in history with such thin naval support as, in his own blunt word, a crime. It is worth pausing on what the great ships of the bombardment force were doing while all this went wrong, because their difficulty explains why the small ships mattered so much. The old battleship Texas had opened the morning by hurling her 14-inch shells at the battery on Pointe du Hoc, firing more than 250 of those enormous rounds in barely half an hour, the longest sustained bombardment of her entire war. The battleship Arkansas worked the eastern half of the sector, throwing her 12-inch shells at the fortified positions around Les Moulins. Off to the eastern flank, two cruisers of the Free French Navy, the Georges Laigle and the Montcalm, lay firing into their own occupied homeland under enormous battle flags, their shells screaming inland toward the country they had been driven out of 4 years before. All of this was tremendous firepower on paper, but the battleships and cruisers were firing from distances of 11,000 yards and more, and from that far out, through smoke and haze, and terrified of dropping a shell among their own men crowding the beach, they could rarely hope to strike a single small casemate tucked into the folds of the bluff and angled cleverly away from their line of sight. Their fire fell on flanks, on inland batteries, on wide areas of ground. It could not reach into the throat of an individual gun the way the moment demanded. The distant giants of the fleet, for all their weight of metal, could not solve the problem on the beach. That would fall to the smallest ships of all. So when the first waves came ashore, a little after 6:30 in the morning, they landed against defenses that were essentially whole. The naval guns had lifted their fire as the troops went in, which was the standard and sensible practice to avoid killing your own men, but it meant that for a crucial stretch of time, the assault crossed the sand with no covering fire at all. The German gunners, who had waited out the brief bombardment safe inside their concrete, came back to their weapons and found the beach below them filling up with men and machines. What followed on the eastern half of Omaha in particular came close to a massacre. The enfilading guns raked the length of the sand. The machine guns cut down entire boat sections in the instant their ramps dropped. The pre-ranged mortars dropped their shells precisely onto the places where men bunched together for cover behind the beach obstacles. The strongpoints were doing exactly what they had been built to do, and the clever design that turned their throats away from the sea was working just as intended, because the sea, for the moment, was doing nothing to trouble them at all. There was supposed to be armor on that beach to answer the German guns, and here the American plan suffered a second collapse. The infantry were meant to be supported by a special kind of tank, a Sherman fitted with a tall canvas flotation screen and a pair of propellers known as a duplex drive tank or a DD tank. The idea behind it was ingenious on paper. These tanks would be launched from their landing craft while still out at sea, would swim to the shore under their own power, and would be waiting on the sand to engage the strongpoints the moment the infantry arrived. On the eastern half of Omaha, the tanks of one battalion were launched into a rough and heaving sea, some 3 miles out from the beach. The flotation screens had been designed for water far calmer than the swells running that morning, screens meant to cope with waves of about a foot, not the chop that was actually running. Of the roughly 30 tanks that were launched, 27 swamped and went to the bottom on the way in, many of them plunging straight down, some carrying their crews with them into the water. Only a couple managed to swim all the way to the beach. A few more were saved only because the crew of one landing craft, seeing what was happening, carried its tanks directly onto the sand instead of launching them. On the western half of the beach, the commander of the other tank battalion looked at the same brutal sea and made the opposite decision. He refused to launch his tanks into it, and instead had them carried all the way to the shore aboard their landing craft, set down directly on the sand. Far more of those tanks survived to fight, and their guns did vital work in the sector below Vierville. But across much of Omaha, the picture in the first hour was stark. The men were pinned on open ground. The tanks that had been promised to them were sinking in the channel or already resting on its floor. The air bombardment had missed the beach entirely, and the naval guns had fallen silent so as not to hit the very troops who now needed them most. The assault was stalling, and in more than one place it was quietly dying. There was one further failure, and it is the one that matters most for understanding what the destroyers did next, so it is worth dwelling on. The plan to bring naval fire down accurately on the strongpoints, once the troops were ashore, depended on special teams that were supposed to land with the infantry. These were the Naval Shore Fire Control Parties, small groups of men who carried radios, and whose whole purpose was to spot targets up on the bluff and call the ships onto them, adjusting the fall of each salvo like a set of trained eyes on land for the guns at sea. It was a sound and necessary idea. But those teams waded ashore into precisely the same storm of fire as everyone else, and they suffered precisely the same fate. Men were killed and men were wounded. Radios were drowned in the surf, or smashed by fragments, or lost altogether when the men carrying them went down. For the critical hours of that morning, the ships lying offshore had almost no reliable eyes on the beach at all. The very system that was meant to connect the enormous firepower of the fleet to the desperate fight on the sand had been broken before it could so much as begin to work. Put all of these failures together, and you arrive at the situation facing the American destroyer captains who lay off Omaha at around 8 o'clock that morning. The infantry were pinned down and bleeding on the sand. The swimming tanks were gone. The air attack had struck empty fields. The heavy ships far out in the bombardment lanes could see very little through the smoke and had almost no spotters left alive and equipped to direct their fire, and in any case, a battleship firing from 11,000 yards or more could rarely hope to hit a small casemate tucked into a bluff and angled away from view. The whole elaborate machinery of fire support had failed, one piece after another, and the German strongpoints, protected by their patient geometry of angled concrete, were plainly winning the battle. Everything the Germans had planned for was coming true in front of their eyes. The one thing they had not planned for, the one contingency that lay entirely outside their careful design, was about to steam straight at them out of the smoke. The destroyers that were about to change the course of this battle belonged for the most part to a single American squadron, Destroyer Squadron 18, commanded by a captain named Harry Sanders. They were not large ships. Each was a little over 340 feet long, displacing somewhere around 1,600 tons, and mounting 4 5-inch guns. In the architecture of a great naval bombardment, ships like these were the light and expendable end of the force. Their assigned tasks were to screen the big ships from submarines, to guard the flanks, and to add the weight of their smaller guns to the general fire from a safe and respectable distance. Their positions were plotted in fire support lanes several thousand yards off the beach. Nothing in their written orders, and nothing in the doctrine they had been trained under for years, told them to do what they were now about to do. The doctrine of naval gunfire support assumed that ships stood off at a distance and reached out toward the shore with their heavy shells. It did not imagine a destroyer deliberately steaming into water barely deeper than the ship itself, in order to fight the enemy at point-blank range like two men trading blows across a table. But the captains of those destroyers could see the beach, and they could see that it was dying, and one by one, several of them stopped waiting for permission. The accounts differ a little on which ship moved first, whether it was the Carmick under Commander Robert Beer or the McCook under Lieutenant Commander Ralph Ramey, but the record is entirely clear that some of them broke the standing order to hold their fire, on their own initiative, and turned in toward the shore. The war diary of one of these destroyers logs the exact moment it broke off from its assigned station and swung in toward the beach, at around 8:30 in the morning. These were officers making a decision, individually and without cover, that the orders they had been handed did not fit the catastrophe in front of them, and that they would far rather answer later for disobedience than sit in deep water and watch the invasion fail on the sand. Then the man commanding the entire bombardment force gave them the sanction they had not stopped to ask for. Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant, aboard the old battleship Texas, had been watching the beach through the smoke, and he understood what was happening on the sand as well as any man afloat. Sometime in the middle of the morning, he put out a general call to his destroyers over the radio, An order that has come down to us in words close to these. "Get on them, men," he said. "Get on them. They are raising hell with the men on the beach, and we cannot have any more of that." It was not the measured language of a fire support plan. It was the voice of a commander throwing the plan overboard and telling his light ships to go in close and save the infantry by whatever means they could find. It is worth understanding for a moment just what kind of ship was being asked to do this, and what the water it entered was really like. These were Gleaves-class destroyers, fast and lightly built, driven by engines that could push them past 37 knots in open water. Each carried a crew of somewhere around 270 men. The 5-inch guns they mounted were among the finest naval guns of their size in the world, dual-purpose weapons that a well-drilled crew could fire 15 or more times a minute from each barrel, throwing a shell weighing about 55 pounds. But these ships had been built to fight other ships and to fend off aircraft in deep open water. Fully loaded, a destroyer of this class drew close to 18 feet beneath the surface, and the water off Omaha, where the captains took them, was in places only 12 to 18 feet deep. The arithmetic is stark when you set those two numbers side by side. A ship drawing 18 feet, steaming into water 18 feet deep, is a ship with nothing at all beneath its keel but sand, feeling the bottom rise up to meet it. The charts of that shoaling water were themselves imprecise, drawn from imperfect surveys, so that a captain edging in toward the beach could never be entirely sure how much water he truly had. Beneath the surface, unseen, lay the added menace of mines, and the hulks of sunken landing craft and drowned tanks that could tear the bottom out of a ship that ran across them. To take a destroyer into that water and hold it there for hours, broadside to a shore lined with guns, was to gamble the ship and every man aboard her on the judgment of the officer on the bridge. What the destroyers did over the next several hours was, by the standards of their own navy, close to reckless, and it is worth being precise about just how reckless. They stood in toward Omaha until the water shoaled away beneath their hulls to a depth of only 12 to 18 feet, until ships that drew most of that depth themselves were feeling for the bottom with their keels. Some of the captains believed afterward that their keels had brushed the sand. One senior admiral said flatly that the destroyers had gone in with their bows against the bottom. They closed to 800, to 1,000, to 1,200 yards from the shoreline, ranges at which their 5-inch guns could be laid onto a target almost the way a man lays a rifle onto a mark. A newspaper correspondent watching from the deck of one of the ships reported that they had come in so close the Germans were striking the hulls with rifle bullets. This was not bombardment as the planners had ever understood the word. This was a warship laying its unarmored flank open to the enemy on the land and daring him to hit back. And here, the destroyers ran headlong into the same problem that had crippled the rest of the fire support plan. With their surefire control parties dead or wounded or stripped of working radios, the ships had almost no one on the beach to tell them what to shoot at, so they solved the problem themselves by improvising a method that no manual had ever prescribed. They watched the beach, and they read the battle as it unfolded. When a surviving Sherman tank down on the sand fired at some point up on the bluff, the destroyer's gunners marked exactly where its rounds struck home, and then they put their own far heavier shells onto the same spot. The American Army's own official history describes this precisely, recording that the destroyer Karmic, by what it called silent cooperation, watched the fire of the tanks it was supporting and used the bursts of their shells as an aiming point for its own guns. There was no radio conversation in that cooperation, no spotter calling out corrections. The ship simply watched where the men on the sand were shooting, reasoned that they were shooting at the enemy, and added the crushing weight of naval shells to their fight. Aboard another destroyer, the flagship Frankfurt, the gunners spotted a single tank at the very edge of the water, immobilized and unable to move, but still firing its gun. They followed each of its shots to where it landed, and walked their own salvos onto the same targets, so that for several minutes a crippled tank on the beach served, without ever knowing it, as the fire control party for a United States warship. The individual actions of these ships, once you look at them one by one, read like a catalogue of a kind of fighting the sea service had never trained its men to do. Take the McCook, working the western stretch of the beach beneath the high cliffs. Her captain, Ramey, found 2 German guns set into the face of the cliff and opened fire on them, holding his fire on the rock for more than 15 minutes. The concentrated pounding did not just silence the guns, it broke the rock strata they were set into. One gun was flung up into the air by the blasts, and the other slid down the face of the cliff and into the sea below. Later in that same long day, the McCook fired 4 salvos into another fortified position near the Vierville draw, and then watched the German garrison come stumbling out of the wreckage with their hands raised over their heads. The ship could not take prisoners aboard in the middle of a battle, so she signaled the surrendering men by light to march east along the beach and give themselves up to the troops there. Roughly 30 prisoners were taken in by the engineers on the sand as a result. It was one of the first times in the entire invasion that a warship had frightened a garrison into surrender by the weight of its fire alone. The Karmik, working the center of the beach in that silent partnership with the tanks, fired more 5-inch ammunition that day than any other ship in the squadron, well over 1,100 rounds, walking her shells methodically along the bluff wherever the tanks below pointed the way for her. The Frankfurt, the squadron flagship with Captain Sanders himself aboard, ran along the eastern beach and turned her whole broadside to the shore to bring all 4 of her guns to bear on the German positions. She fired at a German battery hidden in a stand of trees inland, and later, when army spotters ashore finally managed to reach her by radio, she put her fire into a concentration of German troops behind the beach. The Doyle threaded her way in among the crowded landing craft and fired on a gun that commanded the eastern exit to Colville. The Emmons poured hundreds of rounds into the defenses clustered around the Colville draw. Later in the day, she was told that the church steeple in the village of Colville was being used by German observers to direct fire, and she demolished it, one sailor aboard, recalling that the shells took the steeple down as cleanly as if it had been struck with a great axe. Not every one of these shots found only the enemy, and honesty about that is part of taking the day seriously. Late in the afternoon, several of the destroyers received reports that German observers were using the church towers in the villages of Colville and Vierville as vantage points to direct fire onto the beach. The Harding took the church at Vierville under fire. Her first salvo clipped the cross from the very peak of the steeple, and the shots that followed sliced the tower away 10 feet at a time. Admiral Bryant, watching from the bridge of the Texas, thought it a beautiful sight. But the reality on the ground was bitter, because American troops had already fought their way into Vierville, and the falling masonry and shellfire killed and wounded a number of them. An American officer in the town, seeing what had happened, called it disgraceful. The episode belongs in this account precisely because it is true, and because it shows that the destroyers, for all the salvation they brought that morning, were not delivering some clean and surgical fire. They were fighting a confused and terrible battle through smoke and uncertainty, and sometimes at a cost to their own side. What runs through every one of these separate actions is the same quiet fact, and it is easy to pass over. Not one of these captains had been ordered to do what he did. The manuals they had studied in peacetime, the exercises they had run for years, the whole doctrine of how a destroyer supports a landing, all of it assumed a ship firing from a safe and measured distance under the direction of trained spotters ashore. There was no page in any manual that told a lieutenant commander to drive his ship into 18 feet of water, turn his side to a shore lined with guns, and fire over open sights at a bunker he had located by watching a tank. Each of them worked it out for himself, in the moment, under fire, from the evidence of his own eyes. The initiative came from below, from the men on the bridges of the small ships, and only afterward was it blessed from above. That is a rare thing in any military, and rarer still in the middle of a catastrophe, when the safe and defensible choice would have been to stay in the assigned lane and follow the plan as written. These men chose otherwise, and they chose it independently, ship after ship, which is perhaps the surest sign that the choice was not recklessness, but judgment. The Baldwin, working the eastern end of the beach, drew German blood in return. She was firing on enemy guns near Port-en-Bessin when a German shore battery found her and hit her twice in quick succession. The first shell struck her whaleboat on the starboard side. The second punched a hole roughly 8 inches by 12 in her main deck. By something close to a miracle, not a single man aboard was killed or wounded, and the Baldwin answered the German battery with accurate counter-battery fire until it was silenced. She was the only destroyer in the squadron to be hit during the crucial period of close-in fighting, a reminder that the risk these ships were running was not imaginary. The enemy on the shore could shoot back, and did. Away to the west, at the fist of rock called Point du Hoc, 2 more destroyers of the squadron were fighting a battle of their own. There, Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion was scaling a sheer cliff nearly 100 feet high, under fire, to reach a battery of heavy guns the planners feared could range across both American beaches. The destroyers Satterlee and Thompson, joined by a British warship, worked in close beneath the cliffs, raking the clifftop with fire to keep the German defenders back from the edge, while the Rangers hauled themselves up their ropes. The Rangers' own radios had been soaked useless in the landing, so one of their officers directed the ship's fire using an old signal lamp, blinking corrections out to sea in the manner of an earlier war. When the Rangers reached the top at last, they discovered that the great guns had been pulled back from the cliff and hidden inland, their concrete positions filled with poles to fool Allied reconnaissance. A small party pushed inland, found 5 of the guns hidden in an orchard, and destroyed them with thermite grenades. Through the hours that followed, as the Germans counterattacked the thin band of surviving Rangers again and again, it was naval gunfire, called down from those destroyers offshore, that helped the defenders cling to their scrap of captured cliff. The sheer volume of fire the squadron threw at the coast that day tells its own story. The destroyers of Sanders's command hurled nearly 5,000 5-inch shells into the Omaha defenses in the course of the morning and afternoon. On some of the ships, the gun barrels grew so hot from continuous firing that the crews played fire hoses over them to keep them in action. On at least one ship, the gunners ran clean out of high-explosive shells and began firing star shells instead. The flares meant to light up the night sky, simply to keep steel flying toward the enemy. The admiral commanding the larger naval force grew alarmed at the rate his light ships were burning through their magazines, and sent out an order that the destroyers must husband their ammunition, that resources were limited. It was the fire of ships fighting as though there might be no tomorrow, and for a great many men down on that beach, without it, there very nearly would not have been. Now set yourself back inside that German strongpoint above the Colleville draw while all of this is taking place, and you begin to feel the disbelief that the interrogation reports would later record. For 2 hours, everything had gone according to the design. The infantry had been pinned and cut apart on the sand. The angled guns had done their patient, deadly work. The sea had done nothing at all, exactly as the concrete had been built to ensure. And then the sea changed its nature. A warship that the entire position had been engineered to hold at a safe arm's length came in so close that it was almost aground, turned its long side to the land, and began methodically taking the strongpoint apart from a range at which the careful geometry of the casemate no longer counted for anything. The thick seaward wall was still thick, but a destroyer firing from 1,000 yards was not trying to thread a single lucky shell through a hidden slit from far out at sea. It was sitting off the flank, where the embrasure faced, pouring shell after shell into the position until the gun was wrecked, or the crew was dead, or the survivors broke and ran. The concrete had been designed to defeat distant, inaccurate fire. It simply had no answer to accurate fire delivered from point-blank range, because no one on the German side had ever truly believed that a warship would be reckless enough, or brave enough, to come in and deliver it. The confusion did not stay down in the bunkers with the frightened gunners. It reached all the way up the German chain of command, and the reason it did is revealing. Because the strongpoints had inflicted such terrible carnage in the first hours, and because the German field telephone lines were being cut by the fighting, the picture that filtered back to the higher headquarters was a picture of victory. In the early afternoon, the 352nd Division sent word up to the corps above it that the Allied assault on this stretch of coast had been, in their exact phrase, hurled back into the sea. The landing, they reported, had been defeated at the water's edge, precisely as Rommel's doctrine had promised it would be. This reassuring news was passed further up still, all the way to the army group. For most of that day, the senior German commanders in Normandy believed that Omaha had been held. They were reading the battle from the evidence of the morning, from the burning tanks and the bodies on the sand, and the men sheltering behind the beach obstacles, and they did not yet grasp that beneath all that wreckage, the Americans were slowly grinding their way up the bluffs, and that the destroyers just offshore were methodically dismantling the very strongpoints that were supposed to have won the battle for them. There is a grim irony buried in that afternoon of false confidence. The very thing that made the German reports so triumphant, the sheer volume of dead and wrecked equipment visible on the sand, was also the thing blinding them to the disaster taking shape beneath it. An observer looking down from the bluff at midday saw a beach littered with burning tanks and still bodies, and men lying motionless behind obstacles, and he read that scene, reasonably enough, as a defeated assault. What he could not see, from that height and through that smoke, was that many of those motionless men were alive and beginning to crawl forward, that small parties were already working their way up the draws he could not observe, and that out beyond the surf, the destroyers were sitting in their impossible shallow water, patiently reducing his neighboring strongpoints one by one. The German command was not lying to itself out of stupidity. It was drawing a sound conclusion from the only evidence it could see, in a situation where the decisive events were precisely the ones hidden from view. For hours, the corps and the army above the division continued to report that the landings from the mouth of the Veer eastward had been smashed, that the only truly critical ground lay elsewhere, near the British beaches around Caen. That belief shaped where the German reserves were sent, and where they were withheld, and by the time it finally cracked, the hours it had cost could not be bought back. Only late in the day did the reports begin to change, as word came in that American troops had infiltrated between the strongpoints and were pushing inland. By midnight, General Crace, who commanded the division, was reporting something altogether different from the triumph of the afternoon. He reported the near-total loss of his coastal positions. He said he might contain the Americans through the next day, but that he would need reinforcements after that, and he was told plainly that there were none to be had. The victory the Germans believed they had won in the morning had been quietly taken apart, through the afternoon, by a threat their entire design had been built to shut out. To see why the two sides understood the same battle so differently, it helps to name the two ideas of a warship that collided in the water off Omaha that morning, because they were genuinely different theories, and each of them was perfectly coherent on its own terms. The German theory treated a warship as a creature of distance. Its guns were powerful, yes, but their accuracy fell away sharply with range, and a ship could therefore be kept out at a range where its fire became a matter of luck rather than of skill. Against a warship understood in that way, the correct answer was concrete, made thick where the ship could see it, with the vulnerable openings turned away where the ship could never exploit them. This was not a foolish theory. It was a sound and reasoned response to the naval gunfire the Germans had actually endured in the Mediterranean, which had been delivered by big ships standing well out to sea. Within that theory, the defenses of Omaha were very close to ideal, and for 2 hours on the morning of the 6th of June, the theory held perfectly. The American destroyers were operating, in effect, on a completely different theory, though few of their captains would ever have stopped to phrase it in those terms. In their improvised theory, a warship was not bound to the distance the enemy would have preferred. If the situation on the beach demanded it, a ship could throw away its safe standoff range altogether, accept an enormous risk to itself, come in until its guns could scarcely miss, and fight the shore the way a tank fights, at ranges where geometry and angled concrete stopped protecting the man behind the gun. The entire German design was a careful answer to the first theory. It had no answer whatsoever to the second, because the second theory required the ships to do something their own navy regarded as very nearly suicidal, and the German planners had reasonably assumed that no navy in the world would actually do it. The destroyers prevailed, in the end, not because they were more powerful than the strongpoints they faced. They were not. They prevailed because they refused to fight at the range the strongpoints had been built to defeat. There is a strong temptation to tell this as a story of American daring and nothing more, but that would flatten what actually happened, and it would also be less than the truth. The destroyers succeeded because several separate things came together in the same desperate hours, and each of them was necessary. The men down on the beach, leaderless in places and pinned flat in others, were nonetheless working in small groups up the draws and the bluffs, and it was their fire, again and again, that showed the ships where the enemy lay. The handful of surviving tanks gave the destroyers their aiming points in the smoke. The naval commanders, from the captains who broke their orders to close the beach, to the admiral who blessed the decision after the fact, chose in the moment to tear up a plan they could see was failing. And the ships themselves, and the young men serving their guns, accepted the real risk of running aground and of being hit, in order to fight at a range where they could actually kill the enemy who was killing the infantry. Take away any one of these threads, and the story changes its ending. It was not a single clean act of heroism by one ship or one man. It was a convergence, under fire and under terrible pressure, of improvisation at every level, from the beach to the flagship, and it happened to produce the one thing the German design could not survive. What then did the men who were actually there make of it all, once the smoke had cleared and there was time to reckon up what had happened? The judgments of the participants, and of the historians who came after, run in one direction with an unusual consistency. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the American ground forces for the invasion, and who had spent part of that morning fearing he might have to abandon the beach altogether, wrote afterward, without hedging, that the Navy had saved their hides, and that the guns of those gallant ships that closed the beach had become, in his words, the sole artillery the troops possessed in their worst hour. The commander of the American corps ashore, once his men had finally begun to climb the bluffs, sent Bradley a message that consisted, in essence, of a single line of thanks to the United States Navy. The chief of staff of the 1st Infantry Division, which had fought and bled on the eastern half of Omaha, walked the captured German defenses after the battle, and drew a hard conclusion from what he saw. Those defenses, he judged, should have been impregnable. There was, he wrote, one element of the attack the defenders had not been able to parry, and he had become firmly convinced that it was the supporting naval fire that got the troops in. Without that gunfire, he stated plainly, they could not have crossed the beaches at all. Captain Sanders, whose destroyers had done so much of the close and dangerous work, said that evening that there would have been no landing on Omaha that day had it not been for his squadron. And the official history written by the American Army, weighing all the evidence years later, concluded that after the first waves had gone in, it was naval gunfire that made the substantial contribution to the battle, neutralizing the strongpoints, breaking up the German defense, and coming to dominate the whole assault area. The naval historians who studied the action, some of them men who had themselves served in those very ships, judged that the close fire of the destroyers turned the tide at Omaha in something like 90 minutes of work. And here is the part that is worth holding on to as the smoke settles, because it is the part that is easiest to lose. The German defenses at Omaha were not, in any real sense, a failure. The engineering was sound. The angled casemates, the enfilading guns, the thick seaward walls, the whole intelligent geometry of the position, all of it worked, and worked well. It worked so well that in the first 2 hours of the invasion, it came within sight of defeating the largest amphibious assault ever attempted. The men who built it had studied the threat of naval gunfire with real care, and against that threat as they understood it, they had built something very close to impregnable. What defeated them in the end was not a flaw hidden somewhere in their design. It was that the Americans, when the moment came, simply declined to attack the design on its own terms. The strongpoints had been built to defeat a warship that kept its distance. The destroyers refused to keep their distance, and in that refusal, they turned the whole careful calculation into so much wasted concrete. The German gunner in his casemate above the Colville draw, if he was among those who did not live through that day, died inside a way of understanding the world that had no room in it for the thing that killed him. He had been assured, by his training and by the very shape of the concrete around him, that the sea was a place of distance, and that distance was his shield. His gun pointed along the sand, its throat turned carefully away from the water, its back protected by a wall no ship far out in the channel could ever hope to punch through. Every rule he had been taught told him that a warship could not reach him where he stood, and then a warship reached him. It did not do so by finding some flaw in the geometry, by threading an impossible shell through his hidden slit from far away. It reached him by discarding the single assumption on which the entire geometry rested, the quiet assumption that ships stay out where the water is deep and the risk is low. He could not believe how close the destroyers came, because his whole understanding of what a warship was and where a warship belonged had depended on their staying far away. When they came close instead, that understanding fell apart, and the position built upon it fell apart with it. Two theories of the same battle met in the shallow water off that beach on the morning of June 6, 1944. One theory held that a coastal gun, shielded by thick concrete and set behind a clever angle, was safe from the fleet, and that theory was entirely correct against every enemy who agreed to fight the way it expected. The other theory held that a ship could go wherever its captain was willing to take it, and pay whatever that decision cost, and fight the shore at a range where cleverness in concrete no longer mattered at all. Both of these theories were sound within their own boundaries. Only one of them matched what actually happened in the water off Omaha, where a dozen small ships came in until they could very nearly touch the bottom with their keels, and killed, one after another, the strongpoints that were never supposed to be reachable from the sea. The men who built those strongpoints had thought of everything, except for the possibility that their enemy would refuse to be sensible, and in a battle that hung, for a few hours, on the narrowest of margins, that one thing they had not imagined turned out to be the thing that decided it.